Hello and welcome to the best starter decks for the pre-modern format. In this video I won't be including any decks that require a specific expensive card and it cannot be substituted or removed. All the decks will be to a limit of $500, that's after any non-essential big money cards have been removed. And the way it will work, I'll put them on a grid with the cheap decks at the top and the expensive decks at the bottom. And there are essentially two kinds of decks, reactive and linear. Linear decks just do the same thing every game and as such are easier to learn and pick up for beginners. Reactive decks require knowledge of what our opponents can do and as such are much harder for beginners to pick up. So I'm using a scale to determine this. If I give the deck to a complete beginner who's never played the format before, would they win? Would they have fun? How would they do? So in this grid, in this red area, these are the kind of decks I would definitely avoid. They are expensive and difficult to pick up. Whereas these decks in the green area will be very easy to pick up and very cheap to build. This yellow area will have cheap decks, but they're not so easy to pick up and play. And this area is the opposite of that, decks that are more expensive, but are relatively straightforward to pick up. Reanimator does the same thing every game, so it's fairly straightforward to play, but it is a little expensive and does have cards that don't really go in other decks. Landstill I've included as a budget and regular version. The budget version can be very cheap, but both versions are quite hard to play for new players as we will be very reactive and need to know what our opponents are doing. Goblins can be very straightforward to play as you can just turn guys sideways and win a bunch of games that way. Also, if you take out some of the expensive lands, you can build it for very cheap. Zombies are a little weaker than goblins, so you really do need to make the most of their abilities and interactions, and it does have the black discard spells, so for that reason it's slightly harder to play. It's also a little bit more expensive as well. Psychotog is extremely cheap, especially in budget versions. However, it is a reactive deck, meaning it will be harder to play. The discard spells do allow us to see our opponent's hand, making it slightly easier for beginners than Landstill. Stasis is more of the same, it's a very reactive deck, however it does have the 2-card combo of Stasis and Forsaken City, which can just lock opponents out of the game straight away, so for that reason I think it's slightly easier than Psychotog and Landstill. Dead Guy Ale is a very popular deck and it's not too expensive to build, but it is quite hard to play in my opinion. It's a very reactive deck, you need to know which answers to use on which threats, and it has a horrible mana base, so you really do need to know which hands to mulligan and how the deck will play out over several turns. So Storm can be either very cheap or very expensive depending on the build you want, so I put it here in the middle. This is definitely not the kind of deck I would give to a beginner player. It's really one for someone who knows exactly what they're doing. Budget Terrageddon, so you won't have Mox Diamond here as it's very expensive. This one is reasonably straightforward to play, although it is still very expensive even in its budget forms. The Rock can be built in a number of different ways, but it is still a reactive deck at its core. However, having access to Deed really does make it much more forgiving than some of these other reactive mid-range decks. So I get asked about elves all the time, so here is budget elves. Even if you take out all of the good cards, it's still super expensive, and you probably will need to play 4 natural order to be competitive. It is still a fairly straightforward deck, especially if you take out all of the more complex cards, but it's still, again, very expensive. So Rift Slide is another reactive mid-range deck. This one can actually be very cheap if you take out the Enlightened Tutors, which will help you find your key cards. So there's a few different versions of Oath. Generally, this will be a budget build as most of them do play Mox Diamond. This deck is quite expensive even without those, but it's fairly straightforward as sometimes you just play an Oath and you just win straight away. So that's a really nice thing it has going for it when picked up by a newer player. Mono Black Aggro is a very cheap deck and it's fairly straightforward to play. Mostly the difficulty comes from the discard spells and knowing exactly what to take. Madness is another super cheap one that can be upgraded later with Survival of the Fittest. It's fairly straightforward in that it's aggressive and you can play a lot of your stuff at instant speed, but you do need some knowledge of knowing what to counter and what to let resolve. 3 Deuce or Zoo is a straightforward creature deck, but it is a little bit more expensive as it's 3 colors and you need some of those rare lands. White Weenie is a very cheap and very straightforward deck. It also regularly puts up quite good results in events and is often overlooked in my opinion. The solution is a very reactive deck and will be harder to play for new players as you need to know which threats to answer with which cards. It's also quite expensive because it does require a lot of rares for the mana base. Pit Rack is relatively straightforward, doing the same thing every game, trying to just completely discard our opponent's hand and run them out of resources, and it's a relatively cheap deck to build. You definitely knew Sly would be here. It's very cheap to build, especially if you take out the fetch lands, and it's extremely straightforward to play and very strong. You're probably also waiting for Mono Green, another classic budget deck that's very cheap and relatively straightforward to play. Fluctuator is a very cheap deck to build, although I wasn't really sure where to put it in terms of ease to pick up. I've put it somewhere around the middle, although I could possibly be wrong about that. Dracoblast, not too expensive, and it is a reactive mid-range deck, although it does have a combo in it, which in my opinion makes it slightly easier for beginners to pick up and play. So people always ask me what are the top tier decks. These are the ones that would be considered sort of tier 1, although in this format it is a lot about knowing how your deck works and the matchups. These are the decks that I would personally advise a newer player to try out, as many of them are very cheap and also very straightforward to pick up. But do remember, this format's all about having fun, so the deck that you think will be the most fun is probably the one that you should go for.